Hello again, my name is Roman. I'm here in Lviv, Ukraine with my great friend Curt Doolittle.
Hi, Roman.
Back in 1881, when Ludwig von Mises was born in this city, it was known as Lemberg, part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Curt, you recently posted some very pointed criticism of Ludwig von Mises. What the hell are you doing?
Thanks, Roman. Yeah, I'm getting myself in a lot of hot water. That's what I'm doing. Well, of course, I want to confess the fact that I'm creating a little trouble on purpose, right? Because it raises awareness if you come out as a little bit of a mischief maker. On the other hand, what I'm trying to accomplish is quite serious, and that there's a division in libertarianism between the Anglo-classical liberal psychological school that we tend to think of as the Hayekian is the most modern branch of it. And that's the one that's followed by most universities. And then the cosmopolitan school, which is typified by the German rationalism and Kantianism of the cosmopolitans, including Rothbard and Mises and Hoppe. This is what's happened here, though, is that while the classical liberal school hasn't exactly been successful in resisting the state, and to some degree, the cosmopolitan school, the Misesian school, the Jewish Austrians rather than the Christian Austrians, they have created a lot of noise, and it's actually turned into what I consider the lunatic fringe, and that's the problem is it's causing harm to the cause of liberty. And it's causing harm because Mises just couldn't solve the problem he intuited at that period of time. He couldn't solve it. And so in his desperation, I'm not sure exactly what he did, if he really believed it or he was just doing the best he could. He created, just like Marx did or just like Freud did, a pseudoscience.
Mises, of course, lived through the rise of German socialism as well as the rise of Russian socialism. He was building a bulwark against socialism, and some people consider him the champion of a movement that's growing in influence.
Well, I would argue that the data says that the movement that's growing in influence is classical liberalism, not Rothbardian libertarianism, and I think I'm pretty accurate in that estimate. At least the mainstream one. It doesn't mean that the internet isn't full of a lot of guys with Asperger's syndrome that are running around quoting Mises. But
okay, so maybe we should talk about what Mises got wrong in your view, or the way you put it on Facebook at some point is the lack of action in human action.
I find it incredibly ironic that a man would come up with a philosophy of human action and then discuss it in abstract Kantian terms. Right? Why wouldn't you discuss it in terms of, why wouldn't you describe it as necessary human action? And so your little point here, which is that of action is and Mises' intuition that action is principle to it. His intuition that there was something wrong with the socialist pseudoscience that the socialists were putting out he was correct in all his intuitions.
Yes.
He just couldn't solve it. And so, and I'm going to try to answer that for you, but I want to create enough of a base so that, because the topic, if this was an easy problem, someone would have solved it before I did.
Okay.
It's a non-trivial problem. So what he was trying to do, because remember, in that period of time, you have Wittgenstein and then Russell, and you have this whole attempt to make logic, philosophy into a science. So Mises gets caught in that. And so he tries to position praxeology as a science, and in doing so creates a pseudoscience. Because what separates a science from a non-science is the scientific method, right, which is empirical.
Empiricism, yeah.
Right. And so the point is I'm criticizing Mises because his idea, which he intuited correctly, and out of desperation and in a real circumstance where the world is suffering real pain, he's trying to stop this.
Yes.
Right? He created a pseudoscience, which was then amplified by Rothbard, and now is everywhere.
Should we talk about how it was happening in other disciplines, in mathematics and physics, what was happening around this time?
Yeah, so let's now that we've established that there's a sort of problem, let's address it, right? So if we look at two other movements, physics and science, physics is the most interesting one because a guy named Bridgman looked at Einstein's discovery, and he said, well, we should have figured this out 2 generations ago. The only reason we didn't is because when we were working before, it was sort of at this human scale, and then we went up to this universal scale, and all of a sudden, the way we were thinking about measurement, especially the measurement of length, at human scale, which is really Newtonian, right? Newtonian.
Yes.
And the galactic scale, length actually operates very differently because anything we can perceive operates at the speed of light, which is instantaneous, whereas anything that operates at galactic scale is dramatically affected by the speed of light, which actually in galactic terms isn't all that fast, right?
Okay.
And so what he showed was that if we had instead operationalized, we had spoken of what we were doing in operational rather than abstract verbal terms, rather than allegories and things that we assumed were precise. We'd actually said, how do I physically do that? How do I describe what I'm doing as replicatable things, right? I realize I can go into a painful detail here, but I'm going to try to respect my audience.
Let me see if my summary is correct. Brigman said we needed Einstein because physics as a discipline lost its connection to the real world.
Yes.
It created this sort of jungle gym, this isolated jungle gym of ideas and concepts that were a lot of fun if you played between them, but lost its connection to the real physical operational world.
Yeah, let me give the math example because it's easier in math.
Cantorian sets.
Yeah, Cantorian sets I'll lose some people too. Let's go back to numbers, okay?
Okay.
All right. The simple thing is mathematicians use the word number, and this is well known in math. Anybody who studied mathematical philosophy is right.
Okay.
If you say it's a number, there are only a couple of numbers, right? They're the natural numbers. Everything else on top of that's a function, right? Now you can perform an operation to convert a natural number into all those things we call numbers. And out of convenience, we call all those other things numbers too, but they're not numbers. They're functions.
1.5 is a function.
Is a function, right? And so mathematics consists of a lot of verbal conveniences, right, that they justify in order to get around some real problems of creating a thing like mathematics, which is a general rule independent of scale, what we call arbitrary precision. Right? And so mathematics has to say, well, when I'm talking about things that are this long right here, but I'm talking about things that are 1 million times that size, well, the formula is the same because the ratios are the same. Yes. Right? And so in math, they're trying to do that. But the problem is the difference in precision at this scale that's useful to me, and the difference in precision at intergalactic scale, or heck, the difference between a carpenter sawing a 2x4, right,
yes,
to build your house, and the cylinder in your car, or the gaps in modern high performance machinery, 10,000th of a scale, 100,000th and 10,000th of a scale, an inch.
Difference of precision.
These precision are very, very important. Well, when you take a general rule now, you have a problem of what's precision. Because precision is determined by the context.
So this application of the ideas to the real world is what was lost in mathematics.
Well, you're getting to. Let me go down this because sort of. I mean, it's I'm just going to say in mathematics we create a lot of verbalisms to make it easy for us to talk about things, right? I mean, and to call all these functions numbers is just verbal, right? To say when the mathematics talks about limit functions, I mean, this is a lot of complexity to get around the fact of arbitrary precision. It's just a logical problem, right? When you get into Cantorian sets, Cantor is a great example. He's like Kant. He's created an evil idea that's gone everywhere. I mean, Kant creates the sort of one of the. I mean, he's not necessarily wrong, but he creates this evil idea in order to try to preserve the Protestant ethic.
That rationality is confined to the inside of our skull.
Right, and so then he goes off to Cantor, which Cantor does another verbal contrivance. He says that there are an infinite number of infinities and different sizes of infinities. Well, this is only true just like at small scale, the speed of light's instantaneous, and at large scale, well, it's kind of slow actually. Well, the same thing with Cantorian sets is he's just transformed the idea of repetition, operations, right? Just like mathematicians took the operation necessary to create a fraction and instead just call it a number. Because, it's the same, we don't have to pay attention to all that stuff going on underneath there.
Okay.
Right? And just like when they say the square root of 2 is a number, well, it doesn't exist and you can't. I mean, unless there's a precision, contextual precision, the square root of 2 has to be called a number, but it actually can't be reduced to a number.
So the paradigm of just saying these mathematical contrivances are tools which we apply to the real world, is that...
It's an abstraction. It's a linguistic convenience I think about it in computer science, which is one of the reasons I have a higher opinion of computer science than I do of mathematics, is because computer science...
Make it work.
You have to make it work.
Yeah.
Computer science, computers necessarily require computability, or what we would call in any other field, an existence proof. Whereas in mathematics, you can sort of fudge this a lot and come back later, which is okay in math, because really all these assumptions they're making aren't wrong. They're just covering them with verbalisms. The problem is, in math, after a while, you get all these math students running around to think that these verbalisms are true descriptions of material entities, and we call that mathematical Platonism. Right? That they actually think that there's a mathematical universe they're talking about.
Right.
Instead, they've just created a language for reducing, if they try to talk about it and all these operations that are necessary to produce this number, you'd forget what you were talking about.
Right.
Well, the same thing is true that happened in that math, happened in logic. So you have all you finally get these guys say, well, there's actually everything to do with logic is just tautology, and it's true. There's nothing to be found there.
It's just a game of definitions?
It's a problem like math. If I make a general, we use a number to help us understand something we can't perceive without that number, right? That number is a number, a sequence of digits is a name for a quantity. But we couldn't perceive it except as that name, right? It's bigger or smaller, but that's all we could do. Well, it's the same thing with terms, right? We have names for terms that are just, they have a lot of stuff in them, and we just use those terms. Well, the same thing with logic. If it's an axiomatic system, an axiomatic logical system, when you create a bunch of axioms, every consequence of what you can produce is determined by those axioms. Now, your human mind can't, just like it can't envision the quantities represented by those numbers, can't envision all the consequences of those axioms. But they're deterministically, right? If you create an axiom, it's deterministic. So all you can do with an axiomatic system is test for internal consistency. If I make some set of axioms, is this actually testable, and can I deduce something further on in the consequences because of this thing? But that's all you can do with it. It doesn't correspond to reality. You could make one correspond to reality, but there's always more information in reality than there is
in your
axiomatic description.
Okay.
Right? And the problem with your verbal description of all these things that we talk about, is that you're using a whole lot of cheats, right, to cover functions to get a small enough number of words together that some other guy can process it in 2 seconds and not lose the track of what you're talking about. So this is a very real problem, right? It's not a small problem. We think of this as science and all this other, and philosophy as all these things. We want them to be scientific and provable, but the problem is the information that's present in reality and the information that's present in your axiomatic definitions is very different in quantity. Right? And the information that's incorporated in your verbal theory, your description of causes and events, is less than what's in your reality. If it wasn't less than reality, you couldn't speak it, right? Because there's too much density.
I remember you getting excited at one point when you discovered something called reducible Russian mathematics, or Russian
so that's
reducible.
the point. Let me get it. So if I made the point I have to get across by talking about math and physics is that our verbal descriptions, whether logical or whatever, however they are, they contain a lot of contrivances. So how do we know that we actually know what we're talking about? Well, in mathematics, if I can reduce it to operations starting with natural numbers, well, I can even start it with stones that represent, and then I can make natural numbers out of stones, and then I can make numbers. And there's nothing I can't do in mathematics that isn't able to do that, except as long as we have precision. right? We have some sort of utility function. We're going to try to measure stars or lump 2x4s or something.
You
miles.
can't do infinity though.
Well, infinity doesn't exist because it's not operationally possible, right? Infinity is just an idea. It's the same thing with Cantor sets.
Or limits, yeah.
What Cantor did is he said, well, let's instantaneously pretend there's all these cases, right? And what he converted was frequency to quantity, right? And so instead of saying, that I can produce so many numbers here so fast, which is the integers, right? Or the integers, and I can produce so many other numbers so much faster, which is the real numbers, that there's more integers than that. Well, there's more integers, there's more real numbers in any period of time than there are integers in any period of time, depending on the rate of production of the two things, right? I mean, so he just neutralized time, right, in order to talk about it. Well, of course, there's no extant infinity. If you want to make an existence proof of an infinity, you can't make one because nothing could be operated infinitely, right? I mean, theoretically. Nothing at human scale could be operated infinitely. So we can't make an existence proof. These are just allegories. So his ideas, Cantorian sets, are imaginary tools for us to, just like the square root of 2 is an imaginary tool, right? These are just imaginary tools to help us with our poor little brains envision things we couldn't envision otherwise. But, so the problem is that you have economics, which is typified by Mises, who... Right?
Would you just say that you've described a problem in mathematics that existed around the turn of the previous century, and there was a parallel problem in most disciplines, including economics?
Right, economics, mathematics.
Is that a good summary?
Right, it is, because we went from human scale to beyond human scale in every discipline. Economics stopped being a little thing about the French colony. It's a little bit about my state. It hasn't been about the world. Right? It started to be a general theory, right, at this scale. The same thing happened in mathematics. We went from Newtonian physics to Einsteinian physics, and all of a sudden the concept of length all of a sudden turns into a problem because there's nothing straight.
Yes.
We end up in science in that now we're talking about things where it's not a steam-powered engine where we think about engineering where forces are very obviously transferred in a certain rate of time. Now we have the problem of relative motion. All right, and having to describe relative motion, relative velocity when time is altered, right? So you have all these incredible problems that break human scale. And so what we were still doing is using our verbalisms from the period of human scale and trying to use those analogies instead of reducing those things to what would happen to operations, things we could do. And so what the mathematicians said is you have mathematicians come out and say, there's something really wrong here because at this point we're not actually talking about math, we're talking about philosophy or religion because it's not math anymore, because it's not reducible to operations, right? And so you eventually have this culminate in a large debate, which is, I think you get to the best argument is probably Russian reverse mathematics, which is, you know what, the truth is it doesn't matter how you get to your mathematical answer, you can deduce that any way you It doesn't matter how you get to your scientific hypothesis, you can deduce that any way you want to. It doesn't matter how you get to your economic hypothesis, you can come up with that however you want to. I'm using the word deduce incorrectly here. You can imagine it any way you want to, but once you have, if you can't reduce it to operations, in economics, statements of human action. In mathematics, statements of mental or physical operations, right? In science, of mental or physical operations. If you can't reduce that, then we don't know if you're talking, how much of what you're talking about is imagination or reality. So Mises, as part of a generation, is sort of fighting the problem of Wittgenstein and Russell and those guys in that campus in the analytic philosophy. They're trying to desperately make philosophy into a science. Mises falls into the same trap. And he's not, unfortunately, sophisticated enough about what's going on in mathematics and science to be able to say, wait a minute, and he's probably desperate to get it out because...
And to build a bulwark against socialism.
Because these other guys, they work in math and physics. There's no cost of time in those fields, right? In economics, we have this idiocy called, this really important idea called opportunity cost.
Yes.
And the clock is ticking over here and the world's coming apart because of these socialists, all right? And so Mises is trying, well, I can't, I got to do what I got to, I don't know. I'm just trying to be charitable and say that, he wasn't an ill-intentioned guy, he did the best he could, but he failed worse than the guys did in the other field, because he actually came up with the pseudoscience, while as Brower and Bridgman, they came up with, well, I'm right, except that there's no harm in mathematics for using all these verbal contrivances, because they actually represent, in most cases, provable operations, right? Well, I mean, so, yeah, I could go and operationalize and correctly state even Cantorian sets. I mean, I can do that. I mean, I can translate that, as I did, into a question of frequency and time versus just infinite availability of actions, which is it itself an economically ineconomic statement. And then I can, because it takes energy to manufacture operations. Or in physics, I can say, well, I mean, a lot of the stuff they do is, the limits in physics is that, I mean, you're going to use one set of tests for describing what I do, and I'm going to use another set of tests of describing what I do. But, I mean, they're close enough, right? Because if you reduce it to operations, that means whatever machinery you use to replicate your test, I have to be able to use exactly the same machinery, because that's the same operation that was conducted.
And the operations keep a discipline connected to the real physical
real world.
world.
The physical world. So in the best of terms, I mean, rather than, because that sounds utilitarian, but let's reduce it to operations by analogous of mathematics. When I manufacture numbers by positional numbering, one at a time, right? Positional numbers, right? I'm giving each quantity a name, a unique name created by a system we call numbering, right? Don't take me off yet, right? Position numbering. But when I'm in physics, the unique name I'm giving to anything I observe is the operation I took to observe it. Just as in mathematics, when I'm creating a number, the process of counting the number itself is just the name of the number of counts I've produced.
The unique name you give to something in physics is the operation
necessary to construct
to get there.
Yes, and so it's the observation. So this is an existence proof, right? It exists, all right? Same thing in mathematics. That's an existence proof. In logic, the only existence proof is that I can demonstrate it's reducible to the initial axioms, right?
Yes.
This makes sense to you?
Yeah.
And
you only get back to the axioms, you don't get back to the real physical world.
You can't get back to the real world.
Yeah.
But in economics, this is what Mises was trying to get at, and he just blew it. I mean, he was so close. And I was actually mad at him when I was younger, because I just realized he'd blown it, and because of this, he just messed up the liberty movement. But
we need to articulate his error.
His error is that he's actually right in what he intuits. If you cannot reduce an economic statement to human actions, it cannot be true. I mean, if I manipulate the economy, that's human action, right? That's another human action. That's definitely doable. I can do it. I can distort the information system by putting money into the economy, just like I can distort the information system as it exists today by putting a new product out that's innovative and reduced prices. Right? So economics isn't deducible from human action. It's not, right? You can't because we have too many phenomena we've discovered in economics that aren't deducible. Stickiness of prices wasn't deducible. However, it's explainable. Just like you can make any observation you want in mathematics or physics, but unless you can demonstrate operationally that you can make that observation, you haven't conducted an existence proof. What Mises failed to understand, that the question wasn't scientific, it was moral.
There are two serious disagreements, I think, right here with Mises. One is that economics is not rational, it is in fact empirical, and the other that economics is not morally neutral, it is moral. Can we talk about both of those disagreements?
I can. These are really big topics. So I just went over operationalism,
yes.
which is what I try to make. I'm going to close this with, the reason I push operationalism is you can't testify to any statement. You can't tell me that you're speaking the truth about something that you don't know whether you've imagined or observed. All right? And so in Propertarianism, I rely on testimonial truth, not Platonic truth, but testimonial truth. So that's the innovation I've put into Propertarianism, is that I'm not requiring that you have this imaginary truth out there that Karl Popper has brought into science and the analytical philosophers has brought into science and mathematicians have sort of fabricated as an analogy for testimonial truth. I've tried to reduce ethics back to operational statements with testimonial truth. I can truthfully testify that my statement is true because I can show you how to demonstrate those operations. Right? Same thing in economics, same thing in math, same thing in physics.
You're losing me a little bit. I don't know how to finish the sentence. Ethics can be reduced to operationalism by...
No, your testimony
Testimony.
it can be supported by an existence proof if it's reduced to operational statements.
Or which will be statements about my observations.
Yes, but they will be statements of the actions you took to make your observations.
Mm-hmm.
So in physics, they already do this in science. This is how science is done. You say, I did this test, it produced these results. And if you're like an AGW person and you don't publish your data and your test, then you get hung out to dry by the profession. If you are a guy who's recently put some stem cell research out and you fudge your data, and
like in Japan
and you go commit suicide in that field, right? The problem is in economics we have the state doing this all the time.
Yes, of course.
And giving us stuff, and they can't demonstrate an existence proof, right? And so Mises is actually trying to say that. He's trying to say that, and he's right. The problem is that he's wrong. Economics isn't empirical because we can't deduce all of economics from our initial assumptions about human action. We can, however, observe all the possible results of human action, and then find a way to describe it.
And related to that, there was a term which I just love. I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget. Subjectively testable.
Right, and so you have, I talked about testimonial truth, which is my ability to speak the truth based on my confidence in my observations. I have operationalism, which is my ability to name each extant entity as an operation, right?
Yes.
Reduce everything to names, right? Which is really different from narratives, right? A narrative or a story is an allegory, but a name is not. A name is an existent thing. I have an individual thing.
Okay.
This particular event is reduced to a name. That name may be long, it may be the set of steps in the recipe to take the measurement, but that's the name. And then you have what we call instrumentalism. And so instrumentalism is the idea in observation that once things are that our senses are actually really bad. Now we have empirical psychology, experimental psychology to have done a great job in the past 20 years. Kahneman's probably the best example of it. But even with psychology, in order to rescue itself from Freudian pseudoscience, has adopted operationism, they call it, not operationalism, they call it operationism and instrumentalism, which is if you can't measure it independently and so that it's objectively comparable to something else using some other tools, then we don't know if it's imagination, in other words, your projection on the person, or true. And so the same thing is in all fields. So what instrumentalism is I can make any instrument I can, but I can look at anything. But until I can reduce it to something the human mind is able to compare and make judgments about, just as what a number does. A number allows me to judge two quantities that look the same to me, right?
Okay.
Right? And two velocities that look the same to me. They do two of anything that are.
You describe the process.
Right. And it's the same thing with prices. Prices make commensurable those things are incommensurable.
So getting back to economics and the fact that economics is empiricism.
Is that we use lots of instruments, logical instruments, physical instruments, all sorts of measurements.
Is one of them subjective testability?
And then we have to be able to make, in order to make decisions in science, let me start with science and get to because Mises this is important. So if we start out with science, you say, well, I can use radio telescopes to reduce something to values that I can contrast with each other, but I can't just look at radio telescope information and sort of feel it like cosmic energy, right? I mean, we leave that to the girls who like colored lights. Right? So and the people who do chakras and things. And so we can't really do that. We can't really make those observations because we know how bad we are now at cognitive biases, memory biases, social biases. We have so many that we actually need documents now, tables. I have this huge list on my website of all the kinds of cognitive errors humans make. So we have instruments to help us not only limit our biases, but to help us reduce those things that are beyond our perception to something we can contrast. So the difference is with economics, we don't need other devices. We have ourselves. We're the device, right? If I can't reduce it to a rational human action, in other words, a choice between this and this and this and this, if a human wouldn't do that, I don't need an instrument to tell me that.
Okay.
Mises was trying to say this.
Because we're all close
We're
enough in our
marginally
psychology.
indifferent. Humans are marginally indifferent, or I couldn't empathize with you and you couldn't empathize with me. We couldn't even anticipate each other's desire for trade. I couldn't envision your wants.
Yeah.
Right? And so Mises was trying to say, now our preferences may be marginally different at any point in time. But overall, our preferences and the aggregate are marginally indifferent in regards to circumstance. So if I tell you, these are my circumstances, you will say, yeah, well, in your case, I'd make that decision. And if you tell me the same thing, here's my circumstances, in your case, I'd make that decision, right? We can do that for each other because we're marginally indifferent.
You would disagree with what I consider a Misesian statement that I've heard, that human action is not empirical because every human event, since we're learning creatures, every human event is unique and unrepeatable.
Well, I mean, if you take the universe as a big thing, there's a lot of stuff going on. Well, every event is uniform. But our job is to make general observations and general rules, is to reduce chaos to its necessary properties, so that we can take those necessary properties and find these necessary properties with those necessary properties, those say, well, those things are similar.
Okay.
So we have this ability.
That's from, I think it's from Mises's criticism of positivism. Yeah.
Right. So the problem is he's right in his criticism of positivism. He's right that it's not the only thing we know is that what we can measure. I mean, obviously I can sympathize with your feelings. You can empathize with mine. You can go to a country with complete. I mean, my friend Navin, who's born in India, he says even if I go back to India and I talk to those people, they might as well be from Mars. Yes. Right? He says people in my family in India. I mean, you actually have said this over here a little bit about Ukraine.
Yes.
Is that sometimes those things just don't connect to each other. But on things that are actually abstract, that may be true. But on stuff that you're perceiving, like, does this taste good, or how do I do this, or tie a knot or something, it's the same. Right? So to get back to it, so the moral of the story here is that Mises did not discover operationalism in economics. And if he had, he would have understood that that when I distort something, it's not false. It's that I'm stealing from you. When I distort the economy, it's not false. It's not scientifically false. It's that I'm stealing from you. It's a moral proposition. When a physicist proposes an experiment, not in operational language, he has imposed cost on all other physicists to now make up for his deception, his fraud. Even if it's innocent, it's fraud. He's polluted the commons just like you and I dumping sewage in the river. If a mathematician repeats ideas of mathematical Platonism often enough that he creates two generations of mathematical Platonists who then take mathematical logic and apply it in the common language vernacular of society, so that society starts to believe in pseudoscientific, pseudo-rational ideas as if they're real, he's polluted the normative commons. So what Mises failed to do by reducing it, by trying so desperately, discovering that mathematics was an operational discipline, just like science and mathematics and logic and everything else, every other discipline, he failed to derive that it was an ethical prohibition in his desperate need to want it to be scientific, just like all other philosophers were desperately trying to render philosophy into science. He missed the key question, which would have been given the mathematicians and scientists permission to force their colleagues to render what they have done in a few disciplines, which are under pressure, psychology, their statements in operational language. Because the only language that you can testify to is that which is the use of instruments that you can reduce to subjective judgments that you can make with human capacity, that you can then use to describe and name particular repeatable events that you can then testify to, so that we know that you aren't creating another religion, another cult, another pseudoscience, another form of mysticism, which is what the 20th century is. Just like Hayek intuited, and he said, the 20th century will be remembered as an era of mysticism. That was an era of mysticism created by cosmopolitans in Marx, Freud, Cantor, and unfortunately Mises, creating the 20th century an era of mysticism that only since 1990 have scientists started to correct.
That is a big idea. You're restoring the Enlightenment?
I think that the job of most of us is to redo what we call modernism, right? Which is that the social construction of reality is another creation of religion and mysticism, while as modernism is the description of the world in the scientific terms, real terms. The era of the Enlightenment is universalism. Right? Universalism, universal equality, and all this other stuff, which I think is a topic for another one. I hope that was okay. That was a lot of stuff, dude.
That was big. I'm going to listen to it a few times when it comes out.
Thanks, man. Love you. Appreciate it.
Stay tuned for the next one.
Thank you.